The Cold War did not begin on a specific date or with a dramatic event like a declaration of war or a surprise attack. Instead, it emerged gradually from the ashes of World War II, as the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, forged in the desperate struggle against Nazi Germany, dissolved into mutual suspicion, ideological rivalry, and global confrontation. The transformation from wartime allies to Cold War enemies was one of history's most consequential shifts, creating a bipolar world order that would dominate international relations for nearly half a century. To understand how this happened, we must examine the roots of Soviet-American tensions, the events that turned partnership into enmity, and the personalities who shaped this conflict that would bring humanity to the brink of nuclear annihilation multiple times. The seeds of the Cold War were planted long before World War II ended. The United States and the Soviet Union represented fundamentally opposed visions of how society should be organized. America was a capitalist democracy where private property, free markets, and political liberty were foundational principles. The Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship where the state controlled the economy, individual rights were subordinated to the collective, and political dissent was crushed. These ideological differences had made the two nations adversaries since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The United States had joined other Western powers in intervening militarily to try to overthrow the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, American leaders viewed the Soviet Union as a dangerous revolutionary state dedicated to spreading communism worldwide and overthrowing capitalist democracies. The Soviet leadership, particularly Joseph Stalin, reciprocated this hostility. Stalin saw capitalist nations as inherently hostile to the Soviet Union, believing that they would eventually unite to destroy the world's first socialist state. His paranoia was not entirely unfounded. Hitler's Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 with the explicit goal of destroying Bolshevism and enslaving the Slavic peoples. The fact that Western democracies had initially appeased Hitler and had delayed opening a second front in Europe until 1944 reinforced Soviet suspicions that the West hoped Germany and the Soviet Union would destroy each other. Stalin's worldview was shaped by Marxist-Leninist ideology, which taught that conflict between capitalism and communism was inevitable, and by his personal experience of intrigue and betrayal in Soviet politics, where trust was dangerous and enemies were everywhere. The wartime alliance between America, Britain, and the Soviet Union was always an uneasy partnership of convenience against a common enemy. Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister, had been a fierce anti-communist before the war and would become one again afterward. He famously said that if Hitler invaded hell, he would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons, illustrating that the alliance with Stalin was purely pragmatic. Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, believed he could work with Stalin and build a cooperative post-war order through personal diplomacy and by accommodating Soviet security concerns. Roosevelt understood that the Soviet Union had borne the brunt of the fighting against Germany, suffering over 20 million deaths, and he believed that Soviet cooperation would be essential for maintaining post-war peace and for defeating Japan. The tensions that would define the Cold War emerged clearly at the wartime conferences where Allied leaders met to plan the post-war world. At Tehran in November 1943, at Yalta in February 1945, and at Potsdam in July and August 1945, Stalin, Roosevelt or his successor Harry Truman, and Churchill or his successor Clement Attlee negotiated the shape of post-war Europe. The most contentious issue was Poland. The Soviet Union had been invaded through Poland twice in a generation, first in World War I and again in World War II. Stalin was determined that Poland would never again serve as a corridor for Western invasion, which meant installing a communist government friendly to Moscow. Britain and America had gone to war in 1939 to defend Polish independence, and they were reluctant to simply hand Poland over to Soviet domination. But the reality was that the Red Army occupied Poland and most of Eastern Europe, giving Stalin facts on the ground that the West could not alter without going to war with its ally. At Yalta, an exhausted and dying Roosevelt agreed to compromises that would later be seen as appeasement. Stalin promised to allow free elections in Poland and other Eastern European countries. He promised to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. In return, the Western Allies accepted Soviet territorial gains in Eastern Europe and gave the Soviet Union occupation zones in Germany and Austria. Roosevelt believed he had secured Soviet cooperation for the United Nations and for a peaceful post-war order. But Stalin had no intention of allowing genuinely free elections that might bring anti-Soviet governments to power in Eastern Europe. He interpreted Yalta as Western acceptance of a Soviet sphere of influence. By the time of the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Roosevelt was dead, replaced by Harry Truman, who was far more skeptical of Soviet intentions. Germany had surrendered. The full extent of Nazi atrocities was becoming clear, as was the scale of Soviet domination in Eastern Europe. Truman, though inexperienced in foreign policy, quickly came to see Stalin as an adversary rather than a partner. At Potsdam, Truman informed Stalin that America had successfully tested a powerful new weapon. Stalin showed little reaction, though Soviet spies had already informed him about the atomic bomb project. The atomic bomb would fundamentally alter the strategic balance and fuel the arms race that would characterize the Cold War. America's nuclear monopoly was temporary, but the weapon's existence introduced the possibility that future conflicts could result in the destruction of civilization itself. The end of World War II left Europe divided and devastated. The Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe, with the Red Army's presence ensuring communist control. The Western Allies occupied Western Europe, though their forces were demobilizing rapidly as American and British soldiers demanded to go home. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, though located deep in the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. This division of Germany and Berlin would become a flashpoint for Cold War tensions and a symbol of the broader division of Europe. Stalin began systematically communizing Eastern Europe, installing puppet governments, suppressing opposition, and integrating these countries into the Soviet sphere. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and eventually East Germany became Soviet satellites. The Western response to Soviet expansion was initially uncertain. Some American officials, particularly Ambassador to Moscow George Kennan, warned that the Soviet Union was inherently expansionist and that only firm containment could prevent Soviet domination of Eurasia. Others believed that continued cooperation was possible if the West addressed Soviet security concerns. But events in 1946 and 47 clarified the situation. In March 1946, Winston Churchill, now out of office but still influential, delivered a speech in Fulton, Missouri, declaring that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, dividing the continent into Soviet and Western spheres. Churchill's speech, delivered with President Truman on the platform, signaled that the West recognized the Cold War's existence even if the term was not yet in common use. Soviet actions in Iran and Turkey confirmed Western fears. In Iran, Soviet forces that had occupied the north during the war refused to withdraw, supporting a communist separatist movement. Only American and British pressure forced Soviet withdrawal. In Turkey, Stalin demanded territorial concessions and control over the Turkish Straits, the waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The Turkish government, backed by Britain and America, refused. These Soviet probes seemed to confirm that Stalin was testing Western resolve and would expand wherever he met no resistance. George Kennan's long telegram from Moscow in February 1946 and his subsequent article in Foreign Affairs magazine under the pseudonym Mr. X laid out the strategy of containment that would guide American policy for decades. Kennan argued that Soviet expansion must be contained through patient, firm, and vigilant counterpressure wherever the Soviets sought to expand. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan were the first major implementations of containment. In March 1947, Truman asked Congress for aid to Greece and Turkey, both facing communist insurgencies and Soviet pressure. Truman's speech framed the issue in stark ideological terms, declaring that the world faced a choice between freedom and totalitarianism, and that America must support free peoples resisting subjugation. The Truman Doctrine committed the United States to a global struggle against communism, a commitment that would lead America into conflicts across the globe for the next 4 decades. In June 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall announced a massive economic aid program for European recovery. The Marshall Plan offered aid to all European countries, including those in the Soviet sphere, though Stalin forbade Eastern European countries from participating, seeing the plan as an attempt to undermine Soviet control. The Marshall Plan was arguably the most successful American foreign policy initiative of the 20th century. It provided over $13 billion in aid to Western Europe, equivalent to over $100 billion in today's dollars, helping economies recover, preventing communist parties from gaining power through economic discontent, and binding Western Europe to the United States. The prosperity created by Marshall Plan aid contrasted starkly with the poverty in Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe, providing a powerful argument for capitalism and democracy. But from Stalin's perspective, the Marshall Plan was economic warfare designed to create an anti-Soviet bloc. The division of Europe was hardening into two hostile camps, each viewing the other as an existential threat. The stage was set for a global confrontation that would last nearly half a century and would bring the world repeatedly to the brink of nuclear war. The first major confrontation of the Cold War occurred in Berlin, the divided city that would become the conflict's most potent symbol. In June 1948, the Western Allies introduced a new currency in their occupation zones of Germany to stabilize the economy and combat inflation. The currency reform was economically necessary but politically explosive because it was implemented without Soviet agreement and signaled Western intention to create a separate West German state. Stalin saw this as a violation of wartime agreements that Germany should be treated as a single economic unit. More fundamentally, he saw it as a threat. A prosperous, rearmed West Germany aligned with the West was Stalin's nightmare, the potential core of a new anti-Soviet coalition in the heart of Europe. His response was to blockade Berlin, cutting off all land and water access to the western sectors of the city. 2.5 million Berliners in the western sectors would be isolated, dependent entirely on supplies that could no longer reach them by road, rail, or canal. The Berlin Blockade created the Cold War's first major crisis. Stalin calculated that the Western Allies would either abandon Berlin, demonstrating Western weakness and demoralizing pro-Western Germans, or would attempt to break the blockade by force, which would give Stalin a pretext for war, or would fail, also demonstrating weakness. Stalin believed he held the stronger hand. Berlin was deep in Soviet-controlled territory. Soviet forces vastly outnumbered the small Western garrisons. The Western Allies faced an impossible choice: accept humiliation or risk war. But President Truman and his advisors found a third option. If land routes were blocked, supplies could be flown in. The Berlin airlift began in June 1948 as a limited operation to buy time while diplomats searched for a solution. It evolved into one of the Cold War's most remarkable achievements. For over a year, American and British aircraft flew around the clock, bringing food, fuel, and supplies into Berlin's airports. At the airlift's peak, a plane was landing every few minutes, delivering thousands of tons of supplies daily. Pilots flew in terrible weather, risking their lives to supply the blockaded city. The airlift became a symbol of Western determination and ingenuity. It demonstrated that the West would not be intimidated by Soviet pressure. It also won the propaganda battle. The Soviets were trying to starve a city. The West was feeding it. The contrast could not have been clearer. West Berliners, who had good reason to hate the Western Allies after years of bombing during the war, came to see America and Britain as protectors. By May 1949, Stalin recognized that the blockade had failed. It had not driven the West from Berlin. It had instead accelerated Western plans to create a West German state and had pushed Western Europeans toward military alliance with the United States. The Berlin crisis catalyzed the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In April 1949, while the airlift was still ongoing, the United States, Canada, and 10 European nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty. The treaty committed members to collective defense, stating that an attack on one would be considered an attack on all. This was revolutionary for American foreign policy. The United States had avoided permanent alliances since George Washington's farewell address warning against entangling alliances. Now America was committing to defend Western Europe automatically in case of Soviet attack. NATO transformed the balance of power in Europe. The Soviet Union, despite its massive conventional forces, now faced the prospect that any attack on Western Europe would bring American intervention, including the possible use of nuclear weapons. The formation of NATO prompted a Soviet response. In 1949, the Soviet Union formalized its control over Eastern Europe by creating the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon, to coordinate economic planning, and later in 1955 by establishing the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of communist states. The division of Europe into two hostile military blocs was complete. The Iron Curtain that Churchill had described was now a military reality, with millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and nuclear weapons on both sides. The possibility of World War III launching from a spark in Europe became a constant fear. The two Germanys, the Federal Republic of Germany in the west and the German Democratic Republic in the east, were established in 1949, formalizing the division of the country that would last until 1990. Germany, which had started 2 world wars, was now the potential battlefield for a third. As Europe divided into armed camps, a far more consequential event occurred in Asia. In October 1949, after years of civil war, Mao Zedong's communist forces defeated Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and proclaimed the People's Republic of China. The nationalist government fled to Taiwan, and suddenly the world's most populous nation was communist. The fall of China shocked Americans, who had supported the nationalists with billions in aid. Politicians and pundits demanded to know who lost China, as if China had been America's to lose. The China lobby in Congress blamed the Truman administration and the State Department for failing to support Chiang adequately. These accusations would fuel McCarthyism and would poison American China policy for decades. But the reality was that Chiang's corrupt, incompetent government had lost the support of the Chinese people, while Mao's communists had fought effectively against Japanese invaders and promised land reform and national renewal. The Soviet Union and Communist China signed a treaty of friendship and alliance in February 1950. The Sino-Soviet alliance created the appearance of a unified communist bloc stretching from Berlin to Beijing, controlling a third of humanity and dominating the Eurasian landmass. Western strategists feared that this communist monolith would overwhelm the free world through a combination of military power, ideological appeal, and subversion. The domino theory emerged, the idea that if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would fall in succession like dominoes. This theory would justify American intervention in conflicts around the world, most catastrophically in Vietnam. But the Sino-Soviet alliance was never as solid as it appeared. Stalin and Mao distrusted each other, and their rivalry would eventually lead to a split that would reshape the Cold War. But in 1950, that was not yet apparent. The fear that communism was on the march globally created a climate of paranoia in the United States. The Soviet atomic bomb test in August 1949, years earlier than American experts had predicted, shocked the nation and ended America's nuclear monopoly. The Soviets had the bomb, developed partly through espionage that had stolen American secrets. The revelation that Soviet spies had penetrated the Manhattan Project led to spy trials and executions, most famously of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1953. The combination of Soviet nuclear weapons and communist victory in China created fears that America was losing the Cold War. These fears were exploited by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who claimed in February 1950 to have a list of communists working in the State Department. McCarthyism, the practice of making accusations of subversion without proper evidence, destroyed careers and lives and created an atmosphere of suspicion and conformity. The Truman administration responded to these developments by massively increasing defense spending and adopting a more confrontational posture toward the Soviet Union. National Security Council Report 68, known as NSC 68, completed in April 1950, called for a fundamental shift in American strategy. Instead of limited containment focused on key regions, NSC 68 advocated global containment, treating any communist gain anywhere as a threat to American security. It called for tripling defense spending, developing thermonuclear weapons more powerful than atomic bombs, and building alliances worldwide to encircle the Soviet Union. NSC-68 militarized the Cold War and committed America to a global crusade against communism. Truman initially hesitated to implement NSC-68 due to its enormous cost. Then North Korea invaded South Korea in June 1950, and everything changed. The Korean War transformed the Cold War from a primarily European confrontation into a global conflict. Korea had been divided after World War II, with Soviet forces occupying the North and American forces occupying the South. Separate governments were established, both claiming to represent all Korea. Kim Il-sung, North Korea's communist dictator, received Stalin's approval to invade South Korea, believing the conquest would be quick and that America would not intervene. Stalin miscalculated. Truman saw the invasion as a test of American resolve and as proof that communists would use force to expand. He committed American forces to defend South Korea under United Nations authorization, which was possible only because the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN Security Council and could not veto the resolution. The Korean War would last 3 years, cost millions of lives, and nearly escalate into World War III when China intervened after American forces approached the Chinese border. The Korean War validated NSC-68 and transformed American military posture. Defense spending skyrocketed. American forces were sent to Europe to strengthen NATO. Alliances were formed in Asia, including with Japan, which was rearmed despite its World War II aggression. The United States established a network of military bases around the world, encircling the Soviet Union and China. The Cold War was now militarized, globalized, and institutionalized. What had begun as a conflict over the future of Europe had become a worldwide struggle between two superpowers and their respective blocs. The stakes had been raised from political and economic competition to the possibility of nuclear war. The world had entered an era where, as Winston Churchill would later say, safety would be the sturdy child of terror, and survival the twin brother of annihilation. The Cold War had moved from its formative phase into its dangerous maturity, and the next 4 decades would be dominated by crises, confrontations, and the ever-present fear of the ultimate catastrophe. The 1950s witnessed the Cold War's most dangerous escalation as both superpowers developed thermonuclear weapons capable of destroying entire cities in single explosions. The United States tested the first hydrogen bomb in November 1952 at Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific. The explosion vaporized the island and created a crater over a mile wide. The bomb's yield was over 10 megatons, roughly 700 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. 9 months later, in August 1953, the Soviet Union tested its own thermonuclear device. The nuclear arms race had entered a new and terrifying phase. These were not just bigger bombs. They were weapons that could literally destroy civilization. A full-scale nuclear exchange between the superpowers would kill hundreds of millions immediately and potentially cause nuclear winter that would destroy agriculture and starve billions. Humanity now possessed the means of its own extinction, and the two superpowers controlling these arsenals were locked in ideological conflict. The doctrine of massive retaliation emerged under President Dwight Eisenhower, who took office in January 1953. Eisenhower and his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles sought to contain Soviet expansion while reducing military spending. Their solution was to threaten overwhelming nuclear response to any Soviet aggression, anywhere in the world. Instead of maintaining expensive conventional forces to match Soviet armies, America would rely on nuclear superiority to deter Soviet moves. Dulles declared that America would respond to aggression at places and with means of our own choosing, implying that even limited Soviet aggression might trigger nuclear war. This policy was supposed to provide more bang for the buck, but it was also incredibly dangerous. It meant that minor conflicts could potentially escalate to nuclear war. The death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953 created an opportunity for reduced tensions. Stalin's successors, after a period of internal power struggle, were led by Nikita Khrushchev, who advocated peaceful coexistence with the West. Khrushchev was a true believer in communism who thought the Soviet system would eventually triumph through economic competition rather than military conquest. He denounced Stalin's crimes in a secret speech to the 20th Party Congress in February 1956, shocking communists worldwide and creating hope that the Soviet Union might liberalize. Khrushchev released political prisoners, reduced censorship, and promoted consumer production. He visited the United States in 1959 and met with Eisenhower, creating hopes for détente, a relaxation of tensions. But Khrushchev was also volatile, insecure, and prone to brinkmanship. His attempts to reform the Soviet system threatened hardliners, and his foreign policy oscillated between conciliation and confrontation. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 demonstrated the limits of both Soviet liberalization and Western commitment to liberating Eastern Europe. Hungarian reformers, emboldened by Khrushchev's de-Stalinization, demanded democratic reforms and withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. When the Hungarian government announced neutrality, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest. The Hungarian freedom fighters appealed desperately to the West for help. Radio Free Europe, the American propaganda station, had encouraged Eastern Europeans to resist Soviet rule. But when resistance actually occurred, the West did nothing. Eisenhower recognized that sending American forces into Hungary would risk World War III. The brutal suppression of the Hungarian Revolution, with thousands killed and hundreds of thousands fleeing as refugees, demonstrated that the Iron Curtain was enforced with tanks and that Western rhetoric about liberating Eastern Europe was hollow. The Berlin Crisis of 1958 to 1961 was the next major confrontation. West Berlin, prosperous and free, was a showcase for capitalism deep in communist East Germany. It was also an escape route. Millions of East Germans had fled to the West through Berlin, creating an embarrassing brain drain for the communist regime. Khrushchev demanded that the West withdraw from Berlin and that it become a demilitarized free city. He threatened to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany and turn over control of access routes to the East German government, which the West did not recognize. Eisenhower and later President John F. Kennedy refused. Berlin became a test of wills. Kennedy declared in July 1961 that an attack on West Berlin would be treated as an attack on the United States. The tension was palpable. American and Soviet tanks faced each other at Checkpoint Charlie. War seemed possible. The solution to the Berlin crisis was not negotiation but the Berlin Wall. In August 1961, East Germany, with Soviet approval, began building a barrier to seal off West Berlin. Initially a barbed wire fence, it was soon replaced by a concrete wall topped with barbed wire, flanked by guard towers, minefields, and a death strip where East German guards were ordered to shoot anyone trying to escape. The Berlin Wall was a monument to the failure of communism. A system that had to wall in its population to prevent flight was admitting its own bankruptcy. But the wall also stabilized the situation. It ended the refugee crisis and removed the immediate source of tension. Kennedy privately admitted that a wall was a hell of a lot better than a war. The wall would stand for 28 years, the most visible symbol of Cold War division, until its fall in November 1989 became the symbol of the Cold War's end. The early 1960s brought new dangers as the nuclear arms race accelerated. Both superpowers developed multiple delivery systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and strategic bombers. The concept of mutually assured destruction, abbreviated MAD, emerged. Neither side could launch a nuclear first strike without facing devastating retaliation. Both superpowers would be destroyed in a nuclear exchange. MAD was supposed to provide stability through the balance of terror. As long as both sides knew that nuclear war meant mutual suicide, neither would start one. But this logic required rational actors making careful calculations, and it ignored the possibilities of accident, miscalculation, or crisis escalation. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 would demonstrate how close MAD came to failing and how close humanity came to nuclear war. The Third World became an increasingly important Cold War battlefield. Dozens of former colonies gained independence in Africa and Asia during the 1950s and 60s. Both superpowers competed for influence in these new nations, offering aid, military support, and ideological guidance. The Soviets portrayed themselves as the natural allies of anti-colonial movements, supporting national liberation struggles against Western imperialism. The Americans portrayed themselves as defenders of freedom against communist subversion, though they often supported authoritarian anti-communist regimes. The competition for Third World influence led both superpowers into supporting dictators, funding insurgencies, and intervening in civil wars. The Cold War was being fought not just in Europe but in the jungles of Southeast Asia, the deserts of the Middle East, and the savannas of Africa. The development of nuclear strategy became an entire field of study. Strategists at think tanks like the Rand Corporation developed theories about deterrence, escalation, and crisis management. They calculated acceptable levels of casualties, war-winning capabilities, and credible threats. Herman Kahn's book on thermonuclear war discussed nuclear strategy in coldly rational terms, calculating that civilization might survive a nuclear war if proper preparations were made. Critics like satirist Tom Lehrer mocked the absurdity of planning for nuclear war. The film Dr. Strangelove captured the insanity of nuclear strategy, depicting military and political leaders calmly discussing mass extinction. But the strategists were serious. They believed that nuclear weapons could be managed, that deterrence could be maintained, and that victory was possible even in nuclear war. These theories would be tested in October 1962 when the world came as close to nuclear war as it has ever come, an event that would force both superpowers to reconsider their strategies and seek ways to manage the arms race before it destroyed them both. Cuba, an island 90 miles from Florida, became the flashpoint for the Cold War's most dangerous confrontation. The island had been effectively an American protectorate since gaining independence from Spain in 1898. American corporations owned much of Cuba's economy, and the United States maintained a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a revolutionary movement that overthrew the corrupt dictator Fulgencio Batista. Initially, Castro's revolution was nationalist rather than explicitly communist, but American hostility pushed him toward the Soviet Union. The Eisenhower administration, alarmed by Castro's expropriations of American property and his rhetoric, imposed economic sanctions and began planning to overthrow him. In April 1961, President Kennedy approved an invasion attempt by Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs. The invasion was a fiasco, with the exile brigade defeated and captured within days. The Bay of Pigs humiliated Kennedy and convinced Castro that the United States would not accept his revolution's survival. Castro turned to the Soviet Union for protection and support. Khrushchev saw an opportunity. A Soviet ally in the Western Hemisphere would be a geopolitical triumph, spreading communism to America's backyard and providing leverage against American bases surrounding the Soviet Union. In spring 1962, Khrushchev proposed secretly deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba. The missiles would deter another American invasion attempt, defend the Cuban Revolution, and alter the strategic balance. The Soviet Union was behind in the arms race, with far fewer intercontinental missiles than the United States. Medium-range missiles in Cuba could target American cities without requiring expensive ICBMs. Castro agreed, seeing the missiles as protection against American aggression. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane photographed Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. CIA analysts confirmed that medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads were being installed. These missiles could strike most of the eastern United States within minutes, with no warning time for evacuation or defense. Kennedy was briefed on October 16. The missiles were not yet operational, but they soon would be. Kennedy faced a terrible decision. Allow the missiles to remain and accept a fundamental shift in the strategic balance, or take action to remove them and risk nuclear war. Kennedy convened a secret executive committee, ExComm, to consider options. For 13 days, this group debated how to respond to the greatest crisis of the nuclear age. The hawks on ExComm, particularly Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay, advocated an immediate airstrike to destroy the missile sites followed by an invasion of Cuba. LeMay argued that the Soviets would not risk nuclear war over Cuba and that America had overwhelming conventional and nuclear superiority. He dismissed concerns about escalation, saying that if nuclear war was coming, better to fight it now while America had advantage. Others, including Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and closest advisor, opposed airstrikes. Intelligence could not guarantee that all missiles would be destroyed. Some might survive and be launched at American cities. Moreover, a surprise airstrike would be morally equivalent to Pearl Harbor, a sneak attack that would damage America's moral standing. And most critically, airstrikes would kill Soviet personnel in Cuba, likely triggering Soviet retaliation somewhere, perhaps against Berlin or Turkey where America also had missiles. The XCOM debate was intense and exhausting. Kennedy rejected the airstrike option as too dangerous and the do-nothing option as politically and strategically unacceptable. The compromise solution was a naval blockade, which Kennedy called a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of blockade being an act of war. American naval forces would prevent Soviet ships from delivering more missiles to Cuba while demanding that existing missiles be removed. Kennedy announced the crisis to the American people on October 22 in a televised address, revealing the missiles and the quarantine. The speech was calm but firm, making clear that any missile launched from Cuba would be regarded as a Soviet attack requiring full retaliatory response against the Soviet Union. Americans went to bed not knowing if they would wake to nuclear war. The quarantine went into effect on October 24. Soviet ships approaching Cuba faced a choice: turn back or face interception by American warships. Khrushchev denounced the quarantine as piracy and initially ordered his ships to proceed. American forces went to DEFCON 2, one step below maximum war readiness. Strategic bombers loaded with nuclear weapons circled Soviet borders. Submarines carrying nuclear missiles deployed. Missile crews in their silos prepared to launch. In Moscow and Washington, leaders contemplated decisions that would kill hundreds of millions. At the United Nations, American Ambassador Adlai Stevenson presented photographic evidence of the missiles and challenged Soviet Ambassador Valerian Zorin to deny their presence. Zorin's evasions further damaged Soviet credibility. The world watched in horror as the superpowers edged toward war. On October 25, Soviet ships approaching the quarantine line stopped. Secretary of State Dean Rusk famously said, "We are eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." But the crisis was not over. The missiles already in Cuba remained, and work continued to make them operational. Kennedy tightened the pressure, preparing for airstrikes and invasion if the missiles were not removed. Khrushchev was trapped. Removing the missiles would be humiliating, confirming Soviet weakness and damaging his position at home. But keeping them risked nuclear war that the Soviet Union would lose. On October 26, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a long, emotional letter proposing to remove the missiles if Kennedy pledged not to invade Cuba. Before Kennedy could respond, a second Khrushchev letter arrived on October 27, demanding that American missiles in Turkey also be removed as part of any deal. The hardliners in Moscow had apparently forced Khrushchev to add this condition. October 27 was the most dangerous day of the crisis. A Soviet surface-to-air missile shot down an American U-2 over Cuba, killing the pilot. The XCOM had previously agreed that if a plane was shot down, they would retaliate by attacking the SAM site. Now Kennedy faced that decision. LeMay and the Joint Chiefs urged immediate airstrikes. Kennedy hesitated, suspecting the shootdown might have been unauthorized. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, American destroyers were tracking a Soviet submarine with nuclear torpedoes. The submarine, running low on air and batteries, was forced to surface. The submarine captain considered launching a nuclear torpedo at the American ships. Only the refusal of the submarine's political officer prevented launch, a decision that may have prevented World War III. None of the policymakers in Washington or Moscow knew how close to accidental nuclear war they had come. Kennedy decided on a risky strategy. He would publicly accept Khrushchev's first letter, agreeing to pledge not to invade Cuba if missiles were removed, and would ignore the second letter demanding Turkish missile removal. But privately, Robert Kennedy told Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin that the Turkish missiles would be removed within months, though this could not be part of a public deal because it would look like America was backing down. This secret diplomacy gave Khrushchev a face-saving way out. On October 28, Khrushchev announced that Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba in exchange for an American no-invasion pledge. The crisis was over. The world had stepped back from the nuclear precipice. Both leaders could claim victory. Kennedy had forced the missiles' removal. Khrushchev had protected Cuba from invasion and secured secret removal of Turkish missiles. But the cost of the victory varied for the two leaders. Kennedy's reputation was enhanced. He had stood firm against Soviet aggression while avoiding war, demonstrating coolness under pressure. His approval rating soared. For Khrushchev, the outcome was more mixed. He had backed down in a public confrontation, damaging his standing with Kremlin hardliners. Within 2 years, he would be removed from power, his Cuban adventure one reason cited for his removal. Castro felt betrayed by the settlement, which was negotiated without consulting him. He had wanted the missiles to remain and was furious that Khrushchev had traded them away. Soviet-Cuban relations were strained for months, though they eventually recovered because Cuba had no alternative to Soviet support. The Cuban Missile Crisis transformed the Cold War in several ways. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev were shaken by how close they had come to nuclear war. They had looked into the abyss and pulled back, and they were determined to prevent such a crisis from recurring. In June 1963, Kennedy delivered a speech at American University calling for a re-examination of attitudes toward the Cold War and proposing negotiations to reduce tensions. That summer, the United States and Soviet Union signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, prohibiting nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. It was the first arms control agreement of the Cold War, a modest step but symbolically important. Both sides agreed to establish a direct communication link, the hotline, between the White House and the Kremlin to prevent misunderstandings in future crises. The missile crisis also reinforced the concept of mutually assured destruction and the recognition that nuclear war was unwinnable. Kennedy had rejected the military's advice to launch air strikes, recognizing that escalation could spiral out of control. The crisis convinced many that deterrence was the only viable strategy, that nuclear weapons were political tools for preventing war rather than military tools for fighting it. This understanding would shape strategic thinking for the rest of the Cold War. But the crisis also demonstrated the dangers of brinkmanship and miscalculation. It showed that even rational leaders could stumble into catastrophe through misunderstanding and escalation. The 13 days of October 1962 remained a warning of how fragile peace was in the nuclear age and how close humanity had come to destroying itself over geopolitical competition. The memory of those 13 days would influence policymakers for decades, creating a shared understanding between superpowers that whatever their differences, nuclear war must be avoided. Vietnam became the longest and most divisive American conflict of the Cold War, a quagmire that consumed over 58,000 American lives, destroyed the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, divided American society, and demonstrated the limits of American military power. The roots of American involvement stretched back to the French colonial war in Indochina, but the decisive escalation occurred in the early 1960s as Presidents Kennedy and Johnson committed American prestige and eventually massive military force to preventing South Vietnam from falling to communism. The domino theory, the belief that if Vietnam fell to communism all of Southeast Asia would follow, drove American policy. Vietnam was portrayed as a test of American resolve in the global struggle against communism. Failure in Vietnam, leaders believed, would encourage communist aggression everywhere and undermine American credibility. This logic led America into a war it could not win and would not fully commit to winning, creating a tragic stalemate that cost hundreds of thousands of lives and left scars on American society that remain today. American involvement escalated gradually through the early 1960s. Kennedy inherited a deteriorating situation in South Vietnam where the corrupt, authoritarian regime of No Dinh Diem was losing to communist insurgents. The Viet Cong. Kennedy increased American advisors from fewer than 1,000 to over 16,000, transforming their role from training to active combat support. But the Diem regime was so unpopular and ineffective that in November 1963, with American knowledge and tacit approval, South Vietnamese generals overthrew and murdered Diem. The coup did not improve the situation. It created instability as different generals competed for power while the Viet Cong gained strength. 3 weeks after Diem's death, Kennedy himself was assassinated. Johnson made the fateful decision to escalate in 1964 and 65. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, when North Vietnamese patrol boats allegedly attacked American destroyers, provided the pretext. Johnson asked Congress for authority to take all necessary measures to repel armed attack and prevent further aggression. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution with only 2 dissenting votes, effectively giving Johnson a blank check to wage war. Years later, it would be revealed that the second alleged attack probably never occurred and that the administration had manipulated intelligence to justify escalation. But in 1964, Congress and the public trusted their president. When Viet Cong attacked American bases in early 1965, Johnson ordered retaliatory bombing of North Vietnam and sent the first combat troops. By the end of 1965, there were nearly 200,000 American troops in Vietnam. By 1968, over 500,000. The war strategy was fatally flawed. General William Westmoreland, commanding American forces, pursued a strategy of attrition, trying to kill enemy soldiers faster than they could be replaced. American forces conducted search and destroy missions, using their superior firepower and mobility to find and destroy Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. But the enemy refused to fight on American terms. They avoided large battles where American firepower would devastate them, instead using guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and raids. They melted into the population or retreated to sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos. The body count became the measure of success, with commanders under pressure to produce high enemy casualties. But the numbers were often inflated or fraudulent, and the emphasis on killing created incentives for atrocities. The bombing campaign against North Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder, was equally futile. American aircraft dropped more bombs on Vietnam than were dropped in all of World War II. The bombing was supposed to break North Vietnamese will, interdict supplies flowing south, and force negotiations. It accomplished none of these goals. North Vietnam, a largely agricultural society, had little industry to destroy. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply route through Laos and Cambodia, was impossible to cut from the air. North Vietnamese morale, if anything, was strengthened by the bombing, as the population united against the American threat. The bombing killed thousands of civilians, creating propaganda victories for North Vietnam. And restrictions designed to avoid provoking Chinese or Soviet intervention limited the bombing's effectiveness, though it still caused immense destruction. Back in the United States, opposition to the war grew. The anti-war movement, which began as a fringe position on college campuses, gradually spread to mainstream America. Students protested, burned draft cards, and occupied administration buildings. The draft was deeply unpopular, particularly as it disproportionately affected poor and minority communities while the wealthy and well-connected found deferments. Martin Luther King Jr. denounced the war, connecting it to domestic racial injustice and poverty. War veterans returned home and joined the anti-war movement, lending their voices to protests. The credibility gap between official optimism about the war's progress and the reality visible on television screens every night eroded public trust. Journalists like Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, questioned the war's conduct. The My Lai massacre, where American soldiers murdered hundreds of Vietnamese civilians in March 1968, though not revealed until 1969, symbolized the war's moral corruption. The Tet Offensive in January and February 1968 was the war's turning point. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks on cities across South Vietnam during the Lunar New Year holiday. Militarily, Tet was a defeat for the Communists. They failed to hold any cities, suffered enormous casualties, and did not trigger the popular uprising they hoped for. But psychologically and politically, Tet was a devastating blow to American support for the war. The American public had been told that the enemy was nearly defeated, that victory was near. Now the enemy was attacking Saigon and occupying the American embassy compound. The cognitive dissonance was too great. If the enemy could launch such a massive offensive, clearly they were not nearly defeated. Westmoreland's request for 200,000 additional troops after Tet convinced many, including Johnson himself, that the war was unwinnable at acceptable cost. In March 1968, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election, effectively ending his political career because of Vietnam. He also announced a partial bombing halt and called for negotiations. The decision shocked the nation. A sitting president driven from office by an unpopular war was unprecedented in modern American history. Johnson had come to office with dreams of creating a great society, eliminating poverty and racism. Instead, the war consumed his presidency and destroyed his legacy. Peace talks began in Paris in May 1968, but they would drag on for 5 years while fighting continued. The war had become a domestic political crisis as much as a military one. The 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago was marked by violent clashes between police and anti-war protesters, symbolizing how deeply the war had divided America. Richard Nixon won the presidency in November 1968 partly on promises to end the war, though he claimed to have a secret plan he never revealed. Nixon's strategy was Vietnamization, turning combat responsibility over to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. The policy was designed to placate domestic opinion while avoiding the appearance of defeat. Nixon did reduce American troop levels, from over 500,000 when he took office to under 30,000 by 1972. But he also expanded the war in devastating ways. In 1969, he secretly ordered massive bombing of Cambodia, where North Vietnamese forces had sanctuaries. In 1970, he invaded Cambodia to destroy those sanctuaries, sparking massive protests including at Kent State University where National Guard troops killed 4 students. The invasion widened the war without achieving its objectives. Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger pursued negotiations while maintaining military pressure. The strategy was peace with honor, achieving an agreement that would preserve South Vietnam while allowing American withdrawal. But the North Vietnamese were determined to reunify Vietnam under their control and were willing to wait out the Americans. The negotiations were contentious and frustrating, with both sides making demands the other could not accept. Nixon used bombing to pressure North Vietnam, particularly the Christmas bombing of 1972, the most intensive bombing campaign of the war. Finally, in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. American combat forces would withdraw. American prisoners of war would be released. But North Vietnamese forces could remain in South Vietnam, virtually guaranteeing that the war would continue after American departure. The Paris Accords did not bring peace to Vietnam. They brought peace to America, allowing Nixon to declare peace with honor even though everyone knew the settlement was fragile. American troops came home. The POWs were released in emotional ceremonies. For most Americans, the war was over. But for the Vietnamese, it continued. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a final offensive. The South Vietnamese military, deprived of American air support and suffering from corruption and poor leadership, collapsed. On April 30, 1975, Communist forces entered Saigon. Desperate scenes of Americans and Vietnamese attempting to evacuate by helicopter from the embassy rooftop were broadcast worldwide. South Vietnam had fallen. The dominoes had toppled, though not in the way predicted. Cambodia and Laos also fell to communist forces, but Thailand and other Southeast Asian nations did not. The domino theory, the justification for a decade of war, was proven simplistic. The Vietnam War's legacy haunted America for decades. Over 58,000 Americans died. Hundreds of thousands were wounded physically or psychologically. The war cost hundreds of billions of dollars, contributing to inflation and economic problems in the 1970s. Most tragically, millions of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian civilians and soldiers died. The war destroyed Vietnam's infrastructure and poisoned its land with Agent Orange and unexploded ordnance. The divisions the war created in American society persisted. The credibility gap between government statements and reality undermined trust in institutions. The war demonstrated that American military power had limits, that determination and willingness to absorb casualties could defeat even the world's most powerful military if the war's goals were not supported by the population. The Vietnam Syndrome, the reluctance to commit American forces abroad for fear of another quagmire, influenced American foreign policy for a generation. For the Soviet Union, Vietnam demonstrated that national liberation movements could defeat American imperialism, encouraging support for insurgencies worldwide. The Cold War continued, but Vietnam showed that neither superpower could impose its will everywhere, that the world was more complex than bipolar ideology suggested, and that even superpowers had to recognize limits to their power. The 1970s witnessed a dramatic shift in Cold War dynamics as both superpowers sought to reduce tensions and manage their competition through diplomacy rather than confrontation. This period, known as détente, represented a recognition by both sides that the arms race was economically unsustainable, that nuclear war was unacceptable, and that coexistence required negotiation and compromise. Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger pioneered the American approach to détente, pursuing pragmatic realpolitik that prioritized stability and American interests over ideological crusades. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, who had replaced Khrushchev in 1964, also favored détente, seeing it as a way to gain Western technology and trade while reducing military spending. But détente was controversial in both countries, seen by hardliners as appeasement and betrayal. And it proved fragile, unable to survive the strains of continued competition in the Third World and domestic political changes in both superpowers. The centerpiece of détente was arms control. The nuclear arsenals of both superpowers had grown to absurd levels by the early 1970s. The United States had over 5,000 strategic nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union had achieved rough parity. Both sides had enough weapons to destroy civilization many times over. The concept of overkill was literal. More weapons did not increase security but did increase costs and risks of accident or miscalculation. In May 1972, Nixon traveled to Moscow for a summit with Brezhnev, becoming the first American president to visit the Soviet Union since World War II. The summit produced the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, known as SALT-I, which froze the number of strategic missile launchers at existing levels and limited anti-ballistic missile systems. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, signed alongside SALT-I, was perhaps more significant. Both sides agreed to limit defensive systems that could shoot down incoming missiles. This seemed paradoxical, limiting defenses rather than offenses. But the logic was that effective missile defense would destabilize deterrence. If one side could defend against retaliation, it might be tempted to launch a first strike. Mutually assured destruction required that both sides remain vulnerable. The ABM Treaty enshrined this vulnerability, accepting that security came from the balance of terror rather than from defensive shields. Each side was allowed only 2 ABM sites. This acceptance of permanent vulnerability was psychologically difficult but strategically necessary. It recognized that in the nuclear age, security came from deterrence rather than defense. Nixon and Kissinger pursued triangular diplomacy, playing China against the Soviet Union. The Sino-Soviet split, which had been developing since the late 1950s, had exploded into open hostility by the late 1960s. Border clashes between Chinese and Soviet forces in 1969 threatened war between the two communist giants. Nixon saw an opportunity. If America could establish relations with China, it would gain leverage over both communist powers, each of which would fear an American alliance with the other. In February 1972, Nixon visited China, meeting with Mao Zedong and beginning the process of normalizing relations. The visit shocked the world. Nixon, who had made his career as a fierce anti-communist, was shaking hands with the leader of communist China. But the geopolitical logic was clear. Triangular diplomacy gave America influence over both communist powers and contributed to Soviet willingness to pursue détente. But détente faced challenges from the beginning. Congressional critics, particularly Senator Henry Jackson, argued that détente was one-sided, that America made concessions without demanding Soviet liberalization or better treatment of dissidents. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment linked American trade benefits to Soviet willingness to allow Jewish emigration, injecting human rights into détente despite administration opposition. Conservative Republicans, led by Ronald Reagan, attacked détente as appeasement, arguing that America should seek victory over communism rather than coexistence. On the left, critics argued that détente ignored human rights abuses and supported authoritarian regimes. The contradictions of détente were exposed when the Nixon administration supported brutal dictators like the Shah of Iran and backed the 1973 coup in Chile that overthrew the democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende. The Watergate scandal destroyed Nixon's presidency and undermined American foreign policy. The break-in at Democratic National Committee headquarters in June 1972 was initially dismissed as a third-rate burglary, but investigative reporting revealed White House involvement and a broader pattern of abuse of power. As the scandal deepened through 1973 and 1974, Nixon's ability to conduct foreign policy was crippled. He resigned in August 1974, the only president forced from office, replaced by Gerald Ford. Ford continued détente policies but lacked political capital. The combination of Watergate, Vietnam, and economic problems created a crisis of confidence in America. The imperial presidency was discredited. Congress reasserted itself, passing the War Powers Act to limit presidential authority to wage war. Trust in government reached historic lows. The Soviet Union also faced challenges during détente. The Soviet economy was stagnating, burdened by military spending, inefficient central planning, and technological backwardness. The Soviet system produced steel and tanks but could not produce consumer goods or innovate technologically. Dissidents like Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn challenged the regime's legitimacy, publicizing human rights abuses and the failures of communism. Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, published in the West in 1973, documented the Soviet prison camp system and the millions who died there, dealing a devastating blow to communism's moral claims. Brezhnev's response was a combination of limited repression and détente's benefits. Western trade and technology were supposed to revive the Soviet economy, but they only provided temporary relief without addressing fundamental problems. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 represented détente's high point and also contained the seeds of its undermining. Representatives from 35 nations, including all European countries plus the United States and Canada, signed agreements codifying European borders, increasing economic and cultural exchanges, and, critically, committing signatories to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. The Soviets viewed Helsinki as recognition of their control over Eastern Europe. Western leaders saw the human rights provisions as tools to promote change in communist countries. Dissident groups in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union used Helsinki to demand that their governments honor their commitments. Helsinki Watch committees formed to monitor compliance, becoming focal points for opposition to communist regimes. The accords that Brezhnev thought legitimized Soviet control became instruments for undermining that control. The Third World remained a Cold War battlefield despite détente. Both superpowers continued supporting proxies and clients in conflicts across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The October 1973 Yom Kippur War between Israel and Arab states became a superpower confrontation as the United States supplied Israel and the Soviet Union supplied Syria and Egypt. Nixon placed American forces on nuclear alert when Soviet forces prepared to intervene, risking escalation to defend Israel. The war demonstrated that détente did not prevent crises. The Arab oil embargo that followed the war, retaliating against Western support for Israel, triggered an energy crisis and recession in Western economies. The era of cheap energy was over, contributing to the economic malaise of the 1970s. In Africa, the 1970s saw intensified superpower competition. Portugal's African colonies, Angola and Mozambique, gained independence in 1975 after Portuguese dictatorship collapsed. Civil wars immediately erupted, with factions backed by different external powers. In Angola, the Soviet Union and Cuba supported the Marxist MPLA with weapons and troops. The United States, South Africa, and China supported rival factions. The Angolan Civil War became a proxy conflict showcasing Cold War dynamics. Cuban troops, numbering in the tens of thousands, fought in Angola and later in Ethiopia, spreading Cuban and Soviet influence across Africa. American support for anti-communist forces, including cooperation with apartheid South Africa, compromised American moral authority and demonstrated the contradictions of Cold War alliances. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 seemed to confirm conservative critiques of détente. While America pursued accommodation with the Soviet Union, communism was expanding. The image of helicopters evacuating Americans from the Saigon embassy as communist forces entered the city was a humiliating symbol of American decline. Conservative critics argued that détente had weakened American resolve and encouraged Soviet adventurism. The Ford administration's credibility was further damaged when it failed to respond effectively to the Mayaguez incident in May 1975, when Cambodian communists seized an American merchant ship. Ford's forceful but poorly executed rescue operation resulted in American casualties, reinforcing perceptions of American weakness. By the late 1970s, détente was collapsing under the weight of accumulated tensions and domestic political changes. In the United States, Jimmy Carter won the presidency in 1976 campaigning as an outsider who would restore morality to foreign policy. Carter emphasized human rights, criticizing both Soviet repression and American support for right-wing dictators. His approach angered both the Soviets, who saw it as interference, and American conservatives, who saw it as naive. Carter negotiated SALT II with Brezhnev, continuing arms control efforts, but the treaty faced fierce opposition in the Senate. Critics argued it favored the Soviets and did not adequately address Soviet advantages in conventional forces and intermediate-range missiles. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 destroyed what remained of détente. Soviet forces intervened to support a communist government facing an Islamic insurgency. Carter denounced the invasion as the greatest threat to peace since World War II, withdrew SALT II from Senate consideration, imposed economic sanctions, and organized a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. The Carter Doctrine declared that any attempt to control the Persian Gulf would be repelled by force, extending American security commitments. American support for Afghan Mujahideen fighters, armed and funded through Pakistan with Saudi money, turned Afghanistan into a Soviet Vietnam. The invasion was a catastrophic miscalculation that would contribute to the Soviet Union's eventual collapse. But in 1980, it marked the definitive end of détente and the beginning of what some called the Second Cold War, a period of renewed confrontation that would last until Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. Ronald Reagan came to the presidency in January 1981 with a fundamentally different view of the Cold War than his predecessors. Where Nixon and Kissinger had pursued détente and Carter had emphasized human rights, Reagan saw the Cold War in stark moral terms as a struggle between good and evil. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire in a speech to evangelical Christians in March 1983, declaring that it was the focus of evil in the modern world. Reagan's rhetoric alarmed critics who feared he was dangerously confrontational and risked nuclear war. But Reagan believed that the Soviet Union was economically and morally weak, that aggressive American policies would hasten its collapse, and that freedom would ultimately triumph over communism. His administration pursued the largest peacetime military buildup in American history, supported anti-communist movements worldwide, and challenged Soviet power wherever it appeared. Reagan's approach was controversial and risky, but it would contribute to transformations in Soviet policy that would end the Cold War. Reagan's military buildup was massive. Defense spending increased dramatically, from less than 5% of GDP when he took office to over 6% at its peak. New weapons systems were developed and deployed. The B-1 bomber, cancelled by Carter, was revived. The MX Peacekeeper missile, a massive 10-warhead ICBM, was deployed despite arms control concerns. Cruise missiles and Pershing II intermediate-range missiles were placed in Europe despite massive protests. The 600-ship Navy was built to project American power globally. The military buildup was partly justified by the window of vulnerability thesis, the claim that Soviet missiles threatened American land-based missiles with a disarming first strike. Critics argued the vulnerability was exaggerated and the buildup unnecessary. But Reagan was determined to negotiate from strength, believing that only by demonstrating American resolve could he pressure the Soviets to negotiate seriously. The most controversial element of Reagan's military program was the Strategic Defense Initiative, announced in March 1983. SDI, quickly nicknamed Star Wars by the media, was a proposal to develop space-based systems to destroy incoming Soviet missiles. Reagan's vision was to make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete by creating a defensive shield. The scientific community was skeptical, arguing that the technology was decades away if achievable at all. Critics noted that SDI violated the ABM Treaty and would destabilize deterrence by undermining mutually assured destruction. The Soviets were alarmed, fearing that American defensive systems combined with offensive superiority would give America first strike capability. But Reagan was committed to SDI, both as a technological program and as a moral vision. He genuinely believed that defensive systems were morally superior to deterrence based on the threat of mass murder. The Reagan Doctrine guided American policy in the Third World. Reagan declared that America would support freedom fighters resisting communist governments. This meant supporting anti-communist insurgencies and governments worldwide, often with little regard for their human rights records or democratic credentials. In Nicaragua, the Reagan administration supported the Contras, right-wing rebels fighting the leftist Sandinista government. When Congress prohibited direct military aid through the Boland Amendment, the administration circumvented the law through covert operations, leading to the Iran-Contra scandal. In El Salvador, America supported a brutal military government fighting leftist guerrillas. In Angola, American aid went to UNITA rebels fighting the Cuban-backed government. In Afghanistan, massive American support helped Mujahideen fighters resist Soviet occupation. The Afghanistan War became a Soviet quagmire, analogous to Vietnam for America. Soviet forces could not defeat the Mujahideen, who used guerrilla tactics, operated from sanctuaries in Pakistan, and received increasingly sophisticated American weapons including Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that negated Soviet air superiority. The war killed over 14,000 Soviet soldiers and wounded many more. It cost billions of rubles the Soviet economy could not afford. It demoralized the Soviet public, as young conscripts returned in coffins from an unwinnable war. And it damaged the Soviet Union's international standing, particularly in the Islamic world. The war in Afghanistan was one of several factors that would convince Soviet leaders that fundamental changes were necessary. The Soviet Union in the early 1980s was facing mounting crises. The economy was stagnating, growth rates declining toward zero. Living standards were falling behind the West and even behind some developing countries. Technological innovation was absent outside of military applications. Consumer goods were shoddy and scarce. Agricultural production was so poor that the Soviet Union, with some of the world's most fertile land, had to import grain. The system was held together by oil revenues and police repression. The gerontocracy in the Kremlin, aging leaders clinging to power, seemed unable to address these problems. Brezhnev died in November 1982 after 18 years in power. His successor, Yuri Andropov, was a former KGB chief who recognized the need for reform but died after only 15 months. His successor, Konstantin Chernenko, was old and ill, dying after only 13 months. The rapid succession of dying leaders symbolized a system in terminal decline. The shoot-down of Korean Airlines Flight 007 in September 1983 intensified Cold War tensions. A South Korean civilian airliner strayed into Soviet airspace. Soviet air defenses, assuming it was a spy plane, shot it down, killing all 269 people aboard including an American congressman. The incident shocked the world. Reagan denounced it as a crime against humanity and an act of barbarism. The Soviets initially denied responsibility, then argued the plane was on a spy mission. The tragedy demonstrated how dangerous the Cold War had become, how hair-trigger alert systems and lack of communication could turn navigational errors into catastrophes. It also demonstrated the Soviet system's paranoia and the hardliners' control of policy. In November 1983, NATO conducted Able Archer 83, a command post exercise simulating nuclear war. The exercise was routine for NATO, but the Soviets, already paranoid about American intentions, believed it might be cover for an actual nuclear first strike. Soviet forces were placed on high alert. Nuclear-capable aircraft were readied. Missile crews prepared to launch. The world came closer to accidental nuclear war than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, though neither side realized it at the time. British intelligence detected the Soviet alert and informed Washington. Reagan was sobered by the revelation that Soviet leaders actually feared American attack. He had assumed his tough rhetoric was understood as deterrence. The realization that it was creating genuine fear of war caused Reagan to moderate his approach and seek dialogue with Soviet leaders, if a reasonable one could be found. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. At 54, he was a generation younger than his predecessors, vigorous, intelligent, and aware that the Soviet system was failing. Gorbachev believed that the system could be reformed, that introducing elements of democracy, transparency, and market economics could revive socialism. He did not intend to dismantle the Soviet Union or end communist rule. He wanted to save them. But the reforms he would initiate, glasnost or openness and perestroika or restructuring, would unleash forces that would ultimately destroy both the Soviet system and the empire it controlled. Reagan and Gorbachev met for the first time at Geneva in November 1985. The personal chemistry was surprising. Despite their ideological differences, they established a rapport. They agreed that nuclear war must never be fought and could never be won. The Reykjavik summit in October 1986 produced the most dramatic arms control proposals of the Cold War. Reagan and Gorbachev, meeting in Iceland with minimal staff, came tantalizingly close to agreeing to eliminate all nuclear weapons. Gorbachev proposed cutting strategic weapons by 50%. Reagan proposed eliminating all ballistic missiles within 10 years. Then Reagan suggested eliminating all nuclear weapons within 10 years. The proposals were breathtaking, far beyond what their respective bureaucracies or allies wanted. But the agreement collapsed over SDI. Gorbachev insisted that SDI be confined to laboratory research. Reagan refused to limit his vision of a defensive shield. The summit ended without agreement, and Reagan left disappointed. But Reykjavik demonstrated that both leaders were willing to consider radical reductions and that the arms race might be ending. Reagan's second term saw significant progress in arms control. In December 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. All intermediate-range missiles in Europe were destroyed under intrusive verification. It was the first treaty to actually reduce nuclear arsenals rather than merely limiting growth. The image of Reagan and Gorbachev signing the treaty and shaking hands became iconic, symbolizing the Cold War's transformation from confrontation to cooperation. Reagan's rhetoric also changed. He stopped calling the Soviet Union an evil empire and started praising Gorbachev. In May 1988, Reagan visited Moscow, walking through Red Square with Gorbachev and declaring that the evil empire was another time, another era. But while Reagan and Gorbachev were building a new relationship, the forces Gorbachev had unleashed were escaping his control. Glasnost allowed open discussion of Soviet history, including Stalin's crimes and the system's failures. Nationalist movements in the Baltic republics and elsewhere demanded independence. Economic reforms were creating chaos rather than prosperity. The Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe was unstable, held together only by the threat of Soviet military intervention. Gorbachev's renunciation of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had claimed the right to intervene to preserve socialism, removed the fear that had kept Eastern European communists in power. By 1989, the Cold War was entering its endgame, though few recognized it at the time. Reagan left office in January 1989 believing he had won the Cold War through strength and resolve. George H.W. Bush inherited a transformed relationship with a Soviet Union that was reforming itself and a Soviet empire that was beginning to collapse. The year 1989 witnessed the most dramatic and unexpected series of events in modern European history as the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe collapsed in a matter of months. The revolutions that swept across Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania between August and December 1989 were not initiated by the superpowers. They were popular uprisings against communist regimes that had lost legitimacy and were no longer defended by Soviet military power. Mikhail Gorbachev's decision not to intervene to save Eastern European communist governments, a fundamental break with Soviet policy since World War II, allowed these revolutions to succeed. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989 became the Cold War's most powerful symbol of ending, a moment of joy and liberation broadcast worldwide. But the revolutions also set in motion forces that would destroy the Soviet Union itself within 2 years, transforming the international order and ending the Cold War in ways no one had predicted. Poland was where the unraveling began, though it had been happening gradually for years. The Solidarity trade union movement, led by Lech Walesa, had challenged communist rule since 1980 when strikes at the Gdansk shipyard forced the government to recognize independent trade unions. Solidarity grew to 10 million members, a mass movement demanding political and economic reform. In 1981, facing Soviet pressure, General Wojciech Jaruzelski imposed martial law, crushing Solidarity, arresting its leaders, and driving it underground. But Solidarity survived as a political force, and by the late 1980s, Poland's economy was collapsing. In early 1989, the government agreed to partially free elections. In June, Solidarity won overwhelming victories wherever it was allowed to compete. By August, Poland had a non-communist prime minister, the first in Eastern Europe since the 1940s. The Soviet Union, critically, did not intervene. Hungary followed Poland's path. Hungarian reformers within the Communist Party pushed for economic and political liberalization. In May 1989, Hungary began dismantling the barbed wire fence along its border with Austria, creating the first hole in the Iron Curtain. East Germans on vacation in Hungary realized they could escape to the west through Austria. Thousands did, embarrassing the East German government. In October, Hungary declared itself a republic rather than a people's republic, symbolically rejecting communism. Multi-party elections were scheduled. The Hungarian Revolution was remarkably peaceful, negotiated between reformist communists and opposition groups. But it created momentum that would sweep across Eastern Europe and demonstrated that the Soviets would not intervene to prevent change. East Germany was the keystone of the Soviet Empire in Europe. It was the most ideologically rigid, economically important, and strategically critical Soviet satellite. The German Democratic Republic, as it called itself, was the front line of the Cold War, facing West Germany and NATO. Its collapse would mean the Soviet Union had lost the Cold War in Europe. Through summer and fall 1989, pressure built on the East German regime. Thousands escaped through Hungary. Thousands more occupied West German embassies in Prague and Warsaw, demanding to emigrate. Mass demonstrations in Leipzig and other cities demanded reforms. The protesters chanted "Wir sind das Volk, we are the people," asserting democratic legitimacy against the communist state. Erich Honecker, East Germany's hardline leader, wanted to crush the protests with force, but Gorbachev made clear that Soviet troops would not support repression. In October, Honecker was forced to resign. His successor, Egon Krenz, tried to save the regime through limited reforms, but the crisis was beyond control. On November 9, 1989, the East German government announced that citizens could cross the border to West Berlin. The announcement was poorly prepared and ambiguously worded. When asked when the new rules would take effect, a government spokesman said immediately, without realizing what he was unleashing. Within hours, thousands of East Berliners converged on the checkpoints demanding to cross. Border guards, receiving no orders to use force and overwhelmed by the crowds, opened the gates. The Berlin Wall, the Cold War's most hated symbol, was breached. East and West Berliners celebrated together, dancing on the wall, attacking it with hammers and pickaxes. The images of jubilant Germans celebrating freedom were broadcast worldwide. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a moment of pure joy, the triumph of freedom over oppression. It also marked the effective end of East Germany. Within a year, Germany would reunify, a development that many had thought impossible. The Czechoslovak Revolution followed, so peaceful it was called the Velvet Revolution. Czechoslovakia had been crushed by Soviet tanks in 1968 when it attempted reforms. 20 years later, the regime faced similar demands. In November, sparked by police brutality against students, massive protests erupted in Prague. The Communist Party leadership resigned. Opposition groups, led by dissident playwright Václav Havel, negotiated the transition to democracy. On December 10, the first government in 41 years without communist majority took power. By December 29, Havel was elected president. The revolution was accomplished without violence, through mass protests, negotiations, and the communist regime's recognition that it lacked legitimacy or Soviet backing. Czechoslovakia's peaceful transition inspired hopes that the Cold War's end would be bloodless. Romania shattered those hopes. Nicolae Ceausescu had ruled Romania as a personal dictatorship for 24 years, creating a bizarre personality cult and impoverishing the country while enriching himself and his family. Unlike other Eastern European leaders, Ceausescu refused to consider reforms. In December, when protests erupted in Timișoara, he ordered security forces to fire on demonstrators, killing hundreds. But the protests spread. On December 21, Ceausescu's speech to a rally in Bucharest was interrupted by jeering crowds. The image of Ceausescu, confused and frightened, broadcast on television, destroyed his authority. The army refused to continue shooting protesters and joined them. Ceausescu and his wife fled by helicopter but were captured. On Christmas Day, after a brief show trial, they were executed by firing squad. Romania's revolution was violent and vengeful, a reminder that the end of communism did not guarantee peaceful transitions. George H. W. Bush, who became president in January 1989, managed the end of the Cold War with skill and restraint. Bush was cautious, avoiding triumphalism that might provoke hardliners in Moscow or destabilize Gorbachev. When the Berlin Wall fell, Bush refused to fly to Berlin and celebrate, not wanting to complicate the situation for Gorbachev. Bush and Gorbachev developed a strong working relationship, meeting at Malta in December 1989 to discuss how to manage the rapid changes. Bush supported German reunification while addressing Soviet security concerns. He worked with European allies to ensure that NATO expansion was gradual and that Russia was not isolated. Bush's careful diplomacy helped ensure that the Cold War ended peacefully, without the violence that historical precedent suggested was likely when empires collapsed. But the forces unleashed by reform could not be controlled even by those who initiated them. Gorbachev's reforms were destroying the Soviet system. Glasnost had exposed the regime's crimes and failures. Perestroika had disrupted the economy without creating new prosperity. Nationalist movements in the Baltic republics, Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia demanded independence. In March 1990, Lithuania declared independence, the first Soviet republic to do so. Gorbachev, desperate to hold the Union together, vacillated between reform and repression. He sent troops to crack down in the Baltics, killing protesters in Vilnius in January 1991, but this only strengthened independence movements. He tried to negotiate a new union treaty giving republics more autonomy while preserving some form of union, but this satisfied no one. The failed coup attempt in August 1991 accelerated the Soviet Union's disintegration. Hardliners, alarmed by Gorbachev's reforms and the planned Union Treaty, attempted to seize power. They detained Gorbachev at his dacha, declared a state of emergency, and sent tanks into Moscow. But the coup failed due to incompetence, lack of support in the military, and resistance led by Boris Yeltsin, the elected president of the Russian Republic. Yeltsin defied the coup plotters, famously standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament and rallying opposition. The coup collapsed within 3 days, and Gorbachev returned to Moscow. But Gorbachev's authority was destroyed. Power had shifted to Yeltsin and the Republic leaders. The Communist Party was banned in Russia. The Union was dead in all but name. In December 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved. The leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly and declared the Union ended, forming the Commonwealth of Independent States in its place. On December 25, Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. The red flag with hammer and sickle that had flown over the Kremlin for 74 years was lowered for the last time and replaced by the Russian tricolor. The Soviet Union, the superpower that had challenged American dominance for nearly half a century, the communist state that had inspired and terrified millions, the empire that had controlled a sixth of the Earth's land surface, ceased to exist. The Cold War was over not through negotiation or treaty but through the internal collapse of one of the protagonists. The bipolar world that had defined international relations since World War II had ended, replaced by a unipolar moment with America as the sole superpower. The Cold War's end was greeted with euphoria in the West. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Democracy had triumphed. The evil empire had collapsed. Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history, arguing that liberal democracy had won the ideological struggle and would spread globally. The peace dividend from reduced military spending would fund domestic programs. NATO's purpose seemed fulfilled. Some predicted that war between great powers was obsolete. But the optimism obscured serious problems. Russia's transition to democracy and capitalism was chaotic and painful, creating oligarchs, corruption, and nostalgia for Soviet power. Nationalist conflicts that had been suppressed by communist rule erupted in Yugoslavia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, resulting in wars and ethnic cleansing. The unipolar moment created temptations for America to act unilaterally without regard for international opinion or law. And the assumption that history had ended would prove tragically wrong. New challenges would emerge that did not fit Cold War paradigms: terrorism, failed states, cyber warfare, and great power competition with a resurgent Russia and rising China. The Cold War's end was a triumph, but it also created a more complex and in some ways more dangerous world. The certainties of the bipolar system, however frightening, had provided stability. Their absence would create new uncertainties and new conflicts that continue to shape our world today. The Cold War lasted 44 years, from the breakdown of the wartime alliance in 1945 to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It shaped the lives of billions of people, determined the fate of nations, drove technological innovation, inspired ideological passion, and came perilously close to destroying civilization multiple times. Understanding the Cold War is essential to understanding the modern world because its legacy continues to shape international relations, domestic politics, military strategy, and cultural attitudes. The institutions created to wage the Cold War, from NATO to the nuclear arsenals to intelligence agencies, persist today. The habits of thought developed during the Cold War, the tendency to see the world in bipolar terms of us versus them, continue to influence policy. The unresolved tensions and unfinished business of the Cold War, particularly in Europe and Asia, create conflicts today. Examining what the Cold War was, why it ended, and what lessons it offers remains crucial to navigating the complexities of the 21st century. The most obvious legacy of the Cold War is the nuclear weapons that both superpowers built and that 9 nations now possess. At the Cold War's peak, the United States and Soviet Union together possessed over 60,000 nuclear warheads, enough to destroy civilization many times over. Arms control reduced these arsenals, but the United States and Russia still possess thousands of nuclear weapons capable of destroying cities within minutes. The threat of nuclear war, which dominated Cold War consciousness, remains real even if it receives less attention today. The Cold War demonstrated that nuclear weapons changed the fundamental nature of warfare and international relations. Their destructive power is so great that their use would be civilizational suicide. This makes them simultaneously the ultimate deterrent and the ultimate danger. The Cold War taught humanity that nuclear war must never be fought, but it did not eliminate the weapons or the possibility of their use through accident, miscalculation, or desperation. The Cold War's impact on military affairs extends beyond nuclear weapons. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, satellite reconnaissance, and cyber warfare all have Cold War origins. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address became a permanent feature of American society. Defense contractors, military bases, and weapons research laboratories created economic and political constituencies with vested interests in high military spending. The Cold War normalized peacetime military spending at levels that would have shocked previous generations. The United States maintains hundreds of military bases around the world, a global military presence justified initially by Cold War containment but continuing decades after the Soviet Union's collapse. The question of how much military power America needs and how it should be used remains contested and rooted in Cold War precedents. The institutional legacy of the Cold War includes organizations that define the conflict and that continue to shape international relations. NATO, created to deter Soviet aggression in Europe, not only survived the Soviet Union's collapse but expanded eastward, incorporating former Warsaw Pact members and Soviet republics. This expansion has contributed to tensions with Russia, which sees it as a betrayal of assurances given during German reunification. The United Nations, whose Security Council structure reflects the post-World War II balance of power, remains paralyzed by great power competition reminiscent of the Cold War. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, created to manage the post-war economic order, continue to promote economic liberalization policies that critics see as serving Western interests. The intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA and KGB, which waged covert wars during the Cold War, continue operating though their primary targets have shifted. The Cold War profoundly influenced American society and politics. McCarthyism and the Red Scare damaged civil liberties and destroyed careers. The national security state, with its emphasis on secrecy and executive power, grew dramatically. The military draft, which existed from World War II until 1973, shaped a generation's experience and sparked protests that influenced politics for decades. The Cold War created a military-industrial academic complex where universities conducted classified research and where scientists faced ethical dilemmas about weapons development. It influenced popular culture, from spy novels to science fiction films about nuclear war to children practicing duck and cover drills. The Cold War created anxieties about infiltration, disloyalty, and nuclear annihilation that marked American culture. Some of these anxieties have transferred to new threats like terrorism, but the Cold War's cultural impact remains visible. For the Soviet Union and its successor states, the Cold War's legacy is even more profound. The Soviet Union's collapse created 15 independent nations, several of which remain unstable or authoritarian. Russia, the Soviet Union's successor, experienced a traumatic transition from superpower to regional power, from planned economy to capitalism, from dictatorship to partial democracy and back toward authoritarianism. The 1990s were a decade of economic chaos, demographic collapse, and national humiliation for Russia. Vladimir Putin's rise to power in 1999 represented a rejection of Western-style democracy and a desire to restore Russian greatness. Putin views the Soviet Union's collapse as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century and seeks to rebuild Russian influence in the former Soviet space. This revisionism has led to conflicts with Ukraine and Georgia and to tensions with the West that some call a new Cold War. The Cold War's impact on the Third World was devastating and continues to influence these regions. Proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, and Central America killed millions and destroyed infrastructure. The superpowers supported brutal dictators and funded insurgencies with little regard for local populations. The Cold War twisted development, as countries chose economic systems based on which superpower they aligned with rather than what worked for their circumstances. The debt crises that plagued developing countries in the 1980s and 90s resulted partly from Cold War aid that took the form of loans rather than grants. The failed states and ongoing conflicts in Afghanistan, Somalia, Angola, and elsewhere have roots in Cold War interventions. The Middle East's current conflicts are shaped by Cold War alliances and arms flows. The Cold War's end did not bring peace to these regions but often created power vacuums that led to more violence. The ideological legacy of the Cold War remains contentious. Communism as a governing system was thoroughly discredited by the Soviet Union's collapse and by China's turn toward capitalism. The utopian vision of a classless society achieved through revolution and central planning proved unworkable and led to tyranny and economic stagnation. But capitalism and democracy, which won the Cold War, faced their own challenges. Growing inequality, climate change, financial crises, and the rise of authoritarian populism call into question the triumphalism of the early 1990s. The assumption that liberal democracy would spread globally has proven false as authoritarianism resurges in Russia, China, and elsewhere. The ideological struggle between freedom and tyranny that defined the Cold War has not ended but has taken new forms that do not fit Cold War categories neatly. The question of who won the Cold War and why remains debated. The simplest answer is that the West won because the Soviet system collapsed while Western democracies endured. Ronald Reagan and conservatives argue that American military strength and ideological clarity forced Soviet bankruptcy and demoralization. The Soviet Union could not match American military spending or technological innovation and collapsed trying. This narrative emphasizes American agency and the superiority of capitalism and democracy. Others argue that internal Soviet weaknesses caused the collapse, that the Soviet system was economically inefficient and politically illegitimate, and that it would have collapsed regardless of American policy. This narrative emphasizes Soviet agency or lack thereof and suggests the West's role was less decisive. Gorbachev argues that the Cold War ended through negotiation and mutual understanding, not through victory and defeat, and that both sides deserve credit for avoiding nuclear war and managing the transition peacefully. The truth likely combines elements of all these narratives. American pressure contributed to Soviet difficulties, but internal Soviet problems were primary. The Soviet system's inability to provide prosperity, freedom, or innovation made its collapse likely once a leader willing to attempt reforms came to power. But Gorbachev's choices and Bush's management were crucial in ensuring the collapse was peaceful rather than violent. The Cold War's end was not predetermined or inevitable. Different choices by leaders in Moscow and Washington could have produced different outcomes, including outcomes far worse than what occurred. The peaceful end of the Cold War was a remarkable achievement of diplomacy and restraint that is too often taken for granted. It could have ended in nuclear war, in violent repression of Eastern European revolutions, or in civil war within the Soviet Union that claimed millions of lives. That it ended peacefully was fortunate and owed to decisions by individuals at crucial moments. The lessons of the Cold War for contemporary international relations are complex and contested. Some argue that the lesson is that strength deters aggression, that Reagan's military buildup forced Soviet concessions, and that maintaining military superiority prevents adversaries from challenging American interests. This lesson suggests that engaging authoritarian powers from positions of strength is essential. Others argue that the lesson is that accommodation and diplomacy prevent catastrophe, that Kennedy's restraint during the Cuban Missile Crisis and that détente in the 1970s reduced tensions, and that Gorbachev's willingness to reform enabled the Cold War's peaceful end. This lesson suggests that engagement, arms control, and dialogue with adversaries are essential. Both lessons contain truth, but emphasizing one over the other produces very different policies. The Cold War also teaches the dangers of ideological rigidity and the importance of understanding adversaries. Both superpowers often misread each other's intentions, seeing aggressive plans where defensive fears existed. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was driven partly by fears of Islamic fundamentalism on Soviet borders, but the United States saw it as aggressive expansion. American military exercises in the early 1980s were intended as deterrence, but Soviets feared they were preparations for attack. The assumption that the other side was implacably hostile and aggressive led to arms races, proxy wars, and near catastrophes. The lesson is that even adversaries have legitimate security concerns that must be understood and addressed if conflict is to be managed. Demonizing opponents and assuming the worst about their intentions creates self-fulfilling prophecies where competition spirals toward confrontation. The Cold War demonstrates that international orders are not permanent. The bipolar system that seemed fixed and eternal for decades collapsed in months. The unipolar moment when America was the sole superpower lasted only about 2 decades before China's rise and Russia's resurgence created new great power competition. The lesson is that power distributions shift, that what seems stable can change rapidly, and that preparing for change is essential. The institutions and alliances created for one era may not serve well in the next. The challenge is adapting to new realities while maintaining stability. The Cold War's end created opportunities but also dangers that were not fully anticipated. The assumption that history had ended and that liberal democracy would spread universally proved wrong. The world remains competitive, dangerous, and unpredictable. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Cold War is that nuclear weapons make great power war potentially suicidal but do not eliminate great power competition. The United States, Russia, and China are competitors with conflicting interests and different values. Managing this competition without allowing it to escalate to war is the central challenge of contemporary international relations. The Cold War showed that this is possible, that adversaries can compete for decades without destroying each other, but it also showed how difficult and dangerous it is. Multiple times, miscalculation or accident nearly triggered nuclear war. The Cold War's peaceful end was not inevitable or guaranteed. It required wisdom, restraint, and luck. As great power competition intensifies in the 21st century, the lessons of how the Cold War was managed and how it ended peacefully become increasingly relevant. The nuclear weapons that made the Cold War so dangerous remain. The human fallibility that creates risks of miscalculation remains. The challenge of managing competition without allowing it to spiral into catastrophic war remains. The Cold War is over, but the problems it posed and the dangers it revealed remain with us, requiring the same vigilance, restraint, and wisdom that prevented the Cold War from becoming World War III.